a way of thinking that allows us to begin to kind of contemplate what that situation of Zoom life to be continued might be. So this event has been prompted in part to think about the role of psychoanalysis as it moves to this online space. In what sense has it transformed the psychoanalytic setting, a physical space, into a virtual one? What kind of holding environment or transitional space might psychoanalysis currently be? And with it, the implicit social contract between analyst and analyst, or analyst and patient. Much of psychoanalysis involves holding a certain frame, and that frame seems very much in motion at the moment. How does a practice which turns on the drama that is in the room work without physical space? How does the vitality of presence work without embodiment? In a practice rooted in free association, how does seeing oneself on screen, as I am now, in this kind of digital strange mirror, transform the process of transference? Does psychoanalysis have its own answers to the questions that its current practice poses? I'm interested too in how there is something fundamentally lonely about psychoanalysis as a cultural form and as a social and psychic practice, a loneliness that seems implicit in kind of how psychoanalysis works. Object relations or British school psychoanalysis, as it emerged between and after the Second World War, is preoccupied with the management of loneliness, I think, and sees this management of loneliness as crucially connected to a democratic sociality, to the possibilities of community itself. In The Capacity to Be Alone, to borrow the title of Winnicott's 1958 paper, he writes that the capacity to be alone is a paradox. It is the experience of being alone while someone else is present. For Winnicott, loneliness is the most psychically sophisticated position. The ability to be alone allows one to hold off the threat of loneliness. Loneliness emerges in object relations psychoanalysis as a possibility and is vitally connected to creativity, where in Freud's understanding, it is seen largely as a condition of absence or negativity. In Adam Phillips' essay on risk and solitude, he writes of how loneliness suddenly becomes value added. A condition is required to tolerate the conditions of modern life. The ability to be alone permits the risk that is essential to living. And the idea of risk obviously resonates in particular ways as we daily negotiate whether to risk or to isolate, to obey or to use our own risks within certain social boundaries. The ability to be alone involves in this way the risk of the other, which might also be a way to think about psychoanalysis as a practice, but also the conditions of living in the pandemic. And in object relations, the burden of being able to tolerate loneliness falls on mothers' shoulders. This is the case in Melanie Klein's posthumously published essay on the sense of loneliness, in which she relates the feeling of loneliness as that which emerges in response to the ability to recreate the unconscious communication between mother and child. Loneliness then is about the ability to tolerate less ideal conditions, I think, to make do without them, and also with a less perfect kind of language, possibly itself. In notes to the book that Klein would never get the chance to write, she observes how loneliness might also have something to do with gender, with the constrictiveness of being forced into one identity for a lifetime. In a letter that Bound sends to Klein, he draws to our attention to the need both for a kind of scale of loneliness that recognizes its vital creativity, its presence and genius, risking over-romanticizing it, and in various different manifestations, as well as the inadequacy of our language for loneliness. Something that I think is also so interesting is the way that Phillips too connects loneliness to desire. Through desire, he writes, the child discovers his solitude, and through solitude, his desire. In lockdown, I'm sure all of us have experienced loneliness and desire differently, dependent on our material and physical circumstances. But I'm sure in different ways, the condition of isolation has left us all feeling lonely, and indeed brought a loneliness that had not previously been acknowledged to light. To respond to these questions I have posed here, I could not have hoped for a better duo, so I'm delighted to be joined by Professor Josh Cohen, a psychoanalyst in private practice and Professor of Modern Literary Theory at Goldsmiths. He has written various articles and books on psychoanalysis, literature and philosophy, including The Private Life, Not Working, and most recently, How to Live, What to Do. And by Dr. Jamieson Webster, a psychoanalyst in private practice in New York City. She's the author of The Life and Death of Psychoanalysis and Conversion Disorder, Listening to the Body in Psychoanalysis. She also co-wrote with Simon Critchley, Stay, Illusion, The Hammett Doctrine. She's written for Art Forum, The Guardian, Playgirl, Spike Art Quarterly, the New York Review of Books, and the New York Times. She teaches at the New York School for Social Research and supervises doctoral students in clinical psychology at the City University of New York. She's a member of IPTA and das Unbehagen. Apologies for my lack of German. Josh will speak first on how the enforced solitude of the pandemic has differently affected patients and the various transferential associations evoked in him by their experiences. And his paper will include poems by Emily Dickinson and Rousseau's Reveries of a Solitary Walker. And then Jamieson will speak on a paper she's written for the New York Review of Books, which will come out in edited form in the next month, which is on breathing and being born as a pandemic question. And she will draw on her wonderful paper, which I've had the privilege to read, on Rosine Lefort, Lacan, and Klein on loneliness and being a psychoanalyst. So following the talks, Jamieson and Josh will be in conversation, and then there'll be time for questions from the audience. And just some kind of a last note on housekeeping. I'm sure as you're aware, this event is being recorded. Please do mute yourselves while the speakers are speaking. And if you have any questions during the talk, please do post it in the chat box and we'll get round to responding to it at the end. And you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask questions directly at the end. So that will be kind of towards about 7:15. Great, I will hand over to Josh. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jess. It really is a pleasure to be a part of this, to have the, I accepted your invitation before I knew that I'd be speaking and in conversation with Jamieson, which makes it an extra special pleasure to be part of this. And thank you, Jess, also for that lovely introduction, which introduced the idea of loneliness as a kind of almost a condition of possibility of psychoanalytic work and thinking. And I think it would be worthwhile to just have that notion in mind as we speak and talk to each other. Okay, so in the weeks following the outbreak of the virus, the conditions of lockdown forced me, like all my colleagues, to move my psychoanalytic practice out of the consulting room and onto a digital platform. Having conducted no more than a handful of phone or teleconferencing sessions annually over the last decade, I'm now listening and speaking to pixelated men and women in an empty room for 8 or 9 hours a day. Psychotherapy ordinarily offers a space of continuity in an unstable world. Now it was as helplessly swept up in the crisis as everything and everyone else. So many of the elements that ensure its atmosphere of safety and reliability disappeared overnight. The therapist's physical proximity, the sealed-off privacy of the consulting room, its sense of insulation from the world outside. Many of my patients were now bringing acute distress and anxiety to a screen as small children and pets hovered agitatedly outside bedroom or study doors. What was happening in psychotherapy was only a concentrated instance of what was happening everywhere. The world we had long taken for granted was being withdrawn from us. The fears that devil so many children at night, that their parents will go out never to return, that a monster or ghost will steal in and do them evil, that the world they know and love will simply evaporate overnight. These were becoming the fears of our daily reality. Claire, isolated and alone in her flat, seemed to edge closer with each session to the state of this frightened child. She was ravaged by fear for her elderly, frail father, whom she couldn't stop from leaving his house, and who surely wouldn't survive the virus if he caught it. Her face was much closer to mine than it would have been in the consulting room. She would sob for a while, lamenting repeatedly that she just didn't know what to do, the very fact of her visual proximity amplifying the sense of an unbridgeable chasm. Her bodily distance from me enforced her fright at being cut adrift from everything that had kept her life in place. But this very manifest, voluble suffering often gave way to its opposite, a kind of drained indifference. She would describe churning out her work as an editor, now extracted from the hum of the office, with a frenetic mechanical compulsion. And then she would sink into what felt like a catatonic silence for long intervals, with a glassy stare that seemed not to see me. Bearing witness to this kind of wordless distress over the last year, which remote psychotherapy often seemed to deepen, even as it tried to alleviate it, I found I needed more than ever the drift of my associations, to tune in to the images and stories and melodies and lines of poetry. During one of Claire's sessions, for example, a first line from an Emily Dickinson poem came to me unbidden. There is a pain so utter, and circulated insistently round my head. Here then is the whole poem. There is a pain so utter, it swallows substance up, then covers the abyss with trance, so memory can step around, across, upon it, as one goes with a swoon, goes safely, where an open eye would drop him bone by bone. And I'm aware, or at least I've been aware for the last 8 minutes or so, that Jamieson is going to be talking in part about breath. And of course, one can't talk or think about or read Dickinson without being made intensely aware of breath as a condition for reading as the basis of the rhythm of the poem. So pain at the outer edge, so utter, as Elaine Scarry reminds us, is essentially unshareable, an experience of radical isolation. It swallows substance up, says Dickinson. That is, it seems to suck up every last trace of the self until pain is all that's left of it. At this point, a kind of trance or dissociation kicks in, as though the organism is protecting itself from the knowledge of what's happening to it. It was this kind of trance I felt I was bearing witness to in Claire. And yet other patients seemed to embrace, even relish, their new isolation, and especially the unanticipated pleasure of enforced stillness. Will, a single man in his 30s who had spent his working life assailed by the daily demands of his clients and colleagues in social services, found the newly afforded chance to be alone with himself strangely exhilarating. He rather liked remote psychotherapy. He rather liked, he once said, the pandemic. Placing his laptop screen behind him, rendering each of us more or less invisible to the other, he felt the minimizing of my physical presence loosened the grip of inhibition on his feelings and associations. I feel much closer to myself, he would say. I walk circuits in the park, talking to myself, sometimes imagining I'm talking to you. Being on my own can feel more companionable than being at work, where I can feel like, well, just the sum of my irritations. Social isolation is also being less isolated from myself. Will spoke of his reveries on the sofa, staring into the white ceiling, humming to modern jazz on the stereo. I found myself associating this time to the voice of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, to the transfixing episode of the Fifth Walk in his last unfinished masterpiece of 1776, Reveries of the Solitary Walker. Now in his final years, Rousseau meditated in these walks on his state of solitary exile, the ideal remedy for the traumatic blows of intrigue and treachery he's endured through his life. The Fifth Walk sees Rousseau taking refuge on the tiny Ile de Saint-Pierre set in the middle of the Swiss Lac de Bienne, following the stoning of his house by a mob in the nearby village of Moutier. The quiet and solitude of the island prove the ideal balm for his state of persecuted agitation. Dedicating himself to precious far niente, doing nothing, he embraces a daily life of inactivity, idly gathering botanical specimens, sitting on the banks of the lake or drifting in a little boat into the middle of it. This mode of minimal activity induces a perfect inner state. This is Rousseau. If there is a state where the soul can find a position solid enough to allow it to remain there entirely and gather together its whole being without needing to recall the past or encroach upon the future, where time is nothing to it, where the present lasts forever, albeit imperceptibly, giving no sign of its passing, with no other feeling of deprivation or enjoyment, pleasure or pain, desire or fear than simply that of our existence, a feeling that completely fills the soul. As long as this state lasts, the person who is in it can call himself happy, not with an imperfect, poor, and relative happiness, such as one finds in the pleasures of life, but with a sufficient, perfect, and full happiness which leaves in the soul no void needing to be filled. There is a painful paradox about this moment of perfect happiness. Perfect and eternal it may be, but it cannot last and is therefore imperfect. The sensation of nirvanic bliss, of permanent liberation from the ups and downs of daily life, is an effect of the moment's transience. This bubble of pure selfhood retains its timeless perfection only for as long as one is sealed inside it, immobile and indifferent to the world outside. Total withdrawal cannot be sustained. As soon as the sun starts to set, as soon as the breeze on the lake blows us awake and reminds us that the boat needs taking ashore, we're back in the workaday world of passing time and its frustrations. And reading today, we add to this list of frustrations. The virus is still out there. Still, the fact that this moment must pass is no reason to dismiss it as trivial. Something profoundly significant happens in that boat. The drifting Rousseau discovers a radically free region of the self, defined, in the words of contemporary German philosopher Peter Sloterdijk, by its ecstatic unusability for any purpose. The Rousseau of the Fifth Walk, he writes, is like a nuclear reactor that suddenly radiates pure anarchic subjectivity into the environment. It seems to me that the pandemic has offered us the chance to feel the strange force of this inner nuclear reactor. Psychoanalytic work during the pandemic, as I've experienced it, has pulled the analytic pair between Claire and Will's states of mind, between isolation as dissociated terror and unsuspected bliss. We find each of these varieties of solitude and the shades between them in Winnicott's reflections on the infantile mind. In the earliest phase of life, mind and body exist in the diffuse state of unintegration. The mother's role in this context, and the mother, of course, is a kind of stand-in word in Winnicott for the primary carer. The mother's role in this context is holding, that is, the provision of a rudimentary form for the formlessness of her baby's experience. It's the secured presence of this rudimentary form that allows for the adult mind's foray into the blissfully unintegrated states we find in Rousseau, or more modestly in my patient Will. But the more threadbare this form, the more ordinary unintegration is likely to shade into primitive agonies, into disintegration, precocious self-holding, depersonalization, the mute pain so utter we found in the speaker of Dickinson's poem, in Claire's apparently unseeing stare. In my clinical countertransference, but equally in my ordinary daily life during the pandemic, I've become increasingly aware of my mind's unpredictable shuttling across the different points along this spectrum between empty despair and blissful fullness. I have enjoyed at times a kind of temperamental aptitude for living inside such a radically circumscribed physical and social space for the singular consolations of domestic intimacy. I've sometimes felt that the abstraction of virtual work has made it easier to shut my eyes to receive the patient's communications with a readier and more open ear. But Zoom analysis has also felt like the loneliest imaginable enterprise. A radical deprivation. The loss of the shared space of the consulting room deprives me and the patient of an essential sense of immediacy, of live contact, body to body, unconscious to unconscious. And in ordinary life, I've found this most of all, I think, in the experience of mourning, which of course has proliferated for so many of us in the course of the pandemic, and which has been such an impoverished experience. Mourning is what calls more than anything else for the alleviation, the relief of loneliness, and never, I think, than in our mourning rituals, in Zoom funerals or Zoom wakes or Zoom shivers. Never have we felt more abandoned to the solitariness of our mourning. The vagaries then of teleconferencing quickly undid the consulting room's atmosphere of quiet receptivity. It turns out that the fitful clockwork motion of a buffering icon isn't really a waiting room, that a meaningful silence can be difficult to distinguish from a loss of signal, that the words I'd have spoken into a receptive pause in the here and now of a shared room were liable in the 2-second delay time of Zoom to cut clumsily into the patient's flow of speech. The virus has rendered me all too human, closing my consulting room to protect my own health as well as my patients, whose anxieties over their own and the world's future are self-evidently mine too. It seems apposite that the remote platforms that host our sessions should have become erratic and unreliable, that the stability of the analytic setting should have been put in doubt. And so isolation has emerged for me as the most vertiginously ambiguous of experiences, which I find beautifully captured in another poem of Dickinson's with which I will close. Here, the solitude of the soul in communion with itself is a polar privacy, a solitude more absolute and unrelieved than that of even the sea or death. But it's also a finite infinity in which the mind can swim, play, and immerse. So I will read this very short poem as my conclusion. There is a solitude of space, a solitude of sea, a solitude of death, but these society shall be compared with that profounder sight, that polar privacy, a soul admitted to itself, finite infinity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Josh, for that beautiful paper. I will hand over to Jamieson and then I look forward to kind of reflecting on it more.
Thank you, Josh. You captured so well the problems of trying to translate my dogs might bark, so excuse me everybody, but trying to translate the physical space and intimacy and embodied encounter despite all the deprivations of analysis into Zoom. And a colleague of mine said to me at some point, he said, I don't think we're hurting anybody, but are we really helping? And his question stuck with me. You know, it's maybe important to hold the space, but are we really helping? I can do it on this platform. The last time I saw Josh was in the summer of 2019 in London, and it was the last time I traveled. So this is sort of bittersweet in that way. So I'm happy to be here with him. This is a paper that I worked on about breathing, and it's a companion piece to what I wrote when I was working in palliative care in the months of March, April, and May of last year. So it's a kind of follow-up a year later. Since working as a psychoanalyst in palliative care in the early months of the pandemic, I've had breathing on my mind. I watched coronavirus patients struggling to breathe, breathing by machine, learning to breathe again off the machine if they survive the machine. My son was asthmatic as a child, as was I. Sometimes I believe our asthma was psychosomatic. Patients on occasion have had panic attacks in my office. I've only once considered calling an ambulance. I've worked with breath through pranayama and yoga practice, which calms the nervous system, lowers the rate of respiration, and miraculously reduces dead space in the lungs. Shallow breathing is breathing into dead space, which is not a metaphor. I've also picked up some strange facts. An American pilot named Dr. Bird, who worked on aeronautical oxygen regulation for flying at high altitudes during World War II, was the first person to make a reliable, low-cost, mass-produced ventilator in 1958. He modeled his machine on the way that air moves across the wings of a plane. Airfoils were alveoli. And his device made iron lungs obsolete. He eventually created the baby bird, radically reducing the mortality rate of infants born prematurely. If this story wasn't already uncanny, Dr. Bird's inventions failed to save his first wife, who died of lung damage after severe bronchitis. His second wife died in a plane crash, but his baby bird saved his stepdaughter, who was born 1 month premature. She now runs the museum that bears his name, the Bird Aviation Museum and Invention Center. Helping us to breathe, but also taking our breath away. In this long year, have we not surreptitiously faced an entire human history surrounding breathing? We must not forget what coronavirus, breath, masks, contagion, and death has stirred into consciousness. The video of George Floyd being suffocated by a police officer went viral, reignited the struggle for civil rights and a reconsideration of the violent history of racism in my country, while the cataclysmic forest fires in Australia before the pandemic and California during it, as well as the question of more pandemics as polar ice caps melt, seems to show us the realities of the climate catastrophes to come. The air will become more and more infected, toxic, while asphyxiating forms of oppression will draw us into dead space. Again, this is not a metaphor. Neither is this. The most significant advances in ventilation have taken place in the last 20 years when computers could handle the problem of machines forcing air into delicate lungs, which often injures them. For some reason, it took a long time to understand that you cannot just force someone to breathe indefinitely. The new machines sense the diaphragm's spasm, which signal the desire to breathe, its timing, its volume, which the computers then match to a T. This mimicry of the human body by machines could be a saving grace, especially in the face of an inability to modulate human interventions on life more generally. But just as the internet has played a large part in the destruction of democracy, technology is always a double-edged sword, contributing to the destruction of the planet, no less of ourselves, that it is then called upon to save. This same technology brought the murder of George Floyd, and with him so many others, finally to our attention. Dr. Bird is not a metaphor for Icarus, which is not a metaphor either. Does psychoanalysis have anything specific to say about breathing? It was shocking, even though it should have been obvious, that most of the speculation of early psychoanalysts about psychosomatic asthma or anxiety, whose acute form is always the panic attack, or even autoerotic forms of constricting breath, point to birth. This is seen as either the earliest source of trauma or a trauma that we return to because of others, because of life. Freud had a contentious debate with his colleague Otto Rank, whose theory of birth trauma he saw as committing Oedipal heresy, which had to be the root of all neurosis for Freud. And Rank resigned from the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society in protest and left for Paris in 1926. Freud uses the word Hilflosigkeit to describe infancy and childhood. The translation is helpless or helplessness, which means unable to help oneself, but also not able to give help either. Impotent is another rendition where we should hear powerlessness, defenselessness, and poverty. Regardless of whether a trauma is Oedipal or at birth, the psychoanalytic point seems to be that what is intolerable is helplessness, prematurity, in fact, being born. Spoiling a child, Freud worries, will make fear of the loss of love too great, prioritized above all other dangers, especially real dangers, encouraging the child to remain in a state of childhood and neurotically seek protection and reassurance. But anything that overwhelms the mind, internal or external, sends us tumbling back into a state of utter helplessness, maybe even back to birth, gasping for breath. Freud theorized helplessness again and again throughout his life. He also worried and complained about it bitterly in his letters. Quote, "I've always hated helplessness and penury most of all, and I'm afraid that we are now approaching both." One has to get out of a state of helplessness, but the cost of adult life can be an amnesia for infancy and that portion of childhood when we were unable to help, when we lived in universal poverty. Should these return, they can immediately induce anxiety or rage, a defensive bid for omnipotence as an exit strategy. Enter tyranny, racism, child abuse, disregard for inequality, climate denial. But here I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's see if we can see the forest for the trees. The lungs are in fact one of the last organs to develop in utero as one of the latest acquisitions in evolutionary development, meaning roughly 360 million years ago. But this makes them especially vulnerable. And some consider the lungs the largest organ next to the skin when unfolded. Birth trauma, importantly then, is not just separation from the mother, but also having to breathe, having to take something foreign into the body. We are not only dependent on our caregivers, we are also dependent on air. If separation is a fact, it is also a fragile process. And as with breathing, there are vulnerabilities, forms of resistance, ways of co-opting what seems, at least on the surface, like it should just happen. What kind of an evolutionary trick is this, then? Well, the trick is also key to the development of language. Not only breathing, but eating, and more importantly, speaking or singing, make use of the mouth, the nasal passages, the airways, and diaphragmatic structure of the lungs. Very early, the baby has to find a new kind of life rhythm to that passively lived in utero, centering on sucking, breathing, and cooing, as a counterpart to what is taken in from the world through looking, smelling, and hearing. This sensorium, in fact, swathes the infant in its first months of life. If psychoanalysis is about speaking, say anything, say everything, breathing acts like a hidden navel. Psychoanalysis is ground zero, where we lose our words, maybe even our capacity for self-representation. Breathing is the space where extreme anxiety, the mute body, and the scars of being born rear their head. In a way, at this moment, I'm trying to refrain from using the word crown, especially because of its resonance with corona, but the possibility of choosing one's word carefully is precisely the point. Language, speaking, is critical in the story of being born that seems to need to happen, at the very least, twice. It would be interesting to discuss the relative importance of the control of the bronchus as an organ, writes pediatrician and psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott in 1941. At the Paddington Green Children's Hospital, where he worked for 20 years, he created a model for the observation of a caregiver and their infant under the age of 13 months to establish what he called a psychoanalytic baseline. This is actually work that's much earlier to what both Jess and Josh mentioned, which is interesting because it's kind of like a precursor to Winnicott's later ideas on the transitional object and the capacity to be alone. In this study, he turns to the case of a 7-month-old infant who had an asthma attack while under observation in order to show not only a deviation, but its repair by the psychoanalyst. He writes, quote, "The breathing out might have been felt by the baby to be dangerous if linked to a dangerous idea, for instance, the idea of reaching in to take. It will be seen that the notion of a dangerous breath or of a dangerous breathing or even of a dangerous breathing organ leads us once more to the infant's fantasies. Asthma, Winnicott says, is an involuntary control of expiration, a difficulty letting go of one's breath, or from another angle, an excessive holding of breath. It can only be a fantasy of imagined repercussions that would stop the baby from surrendering to a natural impulse. When natural inclinations are brought to a halt unnecessarily, symptoms erupt. Fortunately, this kind of inhibition in infants, unlike in adults, he says, can be reversed rather quickly by allowing the wish to carry on in its merry way. Babies, he says, are so new to the world, so miraculously open to help. 3 temporal moments transpire that have a logical rhythmic structure, one that almost feels like breathing. To begin, the mother, he says, will enter the room, walk across it, with her baby to Dr. Winnicott, who's sitting at the table. She's asked to sit across from him with the corner of the table between them. Winnicott then places a shiny right-angled tongue depressor, what he calls a spatula, on the table, and he tells the mother to sit in a way that if the baby should want to take the object, they can, but is instructed not to help or interfere and to contribute as little as possible. Here, the classic setting with the couch, the patient, the speech, and the analyst is transformed into the mother, the baby, the spatula, and the doctor. During what Winnicott calls stage 1, the baby puts their hand to the spatula, but realizes that the situation requires more thought. The baby grows still, but not necessarily rigid, and looks at the doctor or their mother with big eyes, or withdrawing from the situation and burying themselves in their mother's chest. Josh, I was thinking of your first patient here. No reassurance is given, as what is key is the spontaneous and gradual return, hopefully, of the child's interest in the seductive object. What dominates is a question about this object and the strange other in the room and what they mean for the baby. Who are you? Who am I? What can I do here? This leads, he says, to the next stage where this hesitation conflicts with the desire. The baby must become, quote, brave enough to let their feelings develop, which will change the picture quickly. Evident first, though, he says, in their body. He notices that the baby's mouth becomes flabby, their tongue thick and soft, and they might even begin drooling. With spatula finally in hand, if they should take it, the infant displays a sense of confidence, even power, giving rise to play, mouthing the spatula, banging it on the table, maybe putting it to their mother or the doctor's mouth and pretending to feed them. One might imagine that this would be the final stage, and Winnicott himself says that he thought so too, and that it took him some time to see that there's an important final move. In stage 3, the infant, in fact, drops the spatula by accident, perhaps, but then plays with getting rid of it, which is then thoroughly enjoyed. The infant may want to get down and mouth the object again on the floor, but eventually will lose interest in the spatula, leave it behind, and turn their attention to the wider room. Leaving the scene with the mother and the doctor and the spatula is a second act of bravery. So what happened with the asthmatic child? Winnicott says that this child was paralyzed in the time of hesitation at stage 1, and that the baby must have felt too greedy, too wary of retribution, too much of a threat of loss, or without the hope for more satisfaction. In listening to this little story, what we see is that we have 3 distinct temporal beats: being, having, not having. Beginning and end meet, being is close to not having, but it's modified by the step of having had. One might even say that being is finally transformed through an act of mourning, of loving and losing, rather than being a place of retreat, of losing oneself entirely, or sticking with the repetitive power of having. Writing was only invented because of an absence, noted Freud, just as the child who cries out at night is not afraid of the dark, but is in fact longing for their loved one. I would say that aside from this last year, the only time I've ever felt this lonely, especially as a psychoanalyst, was when I was a psychoanalyst in training. The question for the analyst in training is about the difficulty of taking on the solitude of the psychoanalytic listener. A movement, surely, from loneliness to solitude can be found, one critical to learning to use one's unconscious life and to take bearing there. But we could say that loneliness is stage 1 and solitude is stage 3 in Winnicott. I was attracted to the story of a mythical analyst, a woman named Rosine Lefort, 30 years old, who begins her analysis with Jacques Lacan in Paris in the 1950s. A year and a half later, she begins work in the hospital Fondation Parents de Raison. Rosine was to work with children between the ages of 1 and 4 who were either abandoned by their families or left for too long because of an illness in their only parent. The hospital at that time did not understand the difference between physical and mental illness, and these children were left in bed for most of the day. Rosine describes them having to watch a nurse feed them, the children, one by one, each knowing full well their place in this line. The work with a 13-month-old in particular, Nadia, is incredibly intense and seems to demand so much of Rosine that she has to use all of herself to help this child, whose health was alarmingly in decline in the manner of a failure to thrive. In fact, the work with between Rosine and Nadia was so difficult that she said she had to leave her analysis. In the beginning months of treatment, Rosine interprets that Nadia is attempting to extract an object from her body that she can tolerate as separate. She says, if it is acknowledged as separate, it could be a source of desire for the child. For Rosine, this is an encounter with a point of loss, however, that is nearly unbearable for her, this case giving us something of the fierce link between being able to desire and having to inevitably confront loss in doing so. She writes of her experience, I was only too sensitive to the limits she imposed on me, having myself suffered from neurosis. It has been through my body that I have experienced this suffering intensely, a body which, as always in such cases, I could only cope with by allowing it to become the object of care and attention. Nadia, for her part, only had her body insofar as it was the object of care and attention. The ambiguous solicitations of caregivers, whether in a family or in an institution, can leave the subject in a totally derelict state of being physically manipulated in the real, without a single word to acknowledge her position as a subject of desire. In the analytic relationship that established itself, Nadia put me in a position where she showed me the real character of my body, while at the same time forcing me to renounce it. It was in this position that I was to let her challenge me, to listen to what she had to say, to let her speak death in order to live. These are the renunciations we all have to learn to make when taking up the position of the analyst, and the loneliness and solitude of these renunciations make up a large part of the training process. But jumping to the pandemic, are we not stretched here between the real of our bodies and a host of renunciations where we must try to keep desire alive? And we're facing, I think, the extreme difficulties in doing so. And there's something about being left in this derelict state, which I think Josh also spoke to, that I think is the real danger of the pandemic. Lacan and Melanie Klein, despite wildly diverging clinical languages, are two thinkers that I have found who speak about loneliness and seem to do so in connection with the very ethos of psychoanalysis itself. Loneliness, Klein says in her paper on the sense of loneliness, comes from the impossibility of achieving any final integration, quote, a ubiquitous yearning for an unattainable, perfect internal state. Not belonging has deeper meaning, for some parts of the self cannot be regained, contributing to the feeling that one is not in full possession of oneself, that one does not fully belong to oneself or therefore to anybody. Lost parts too, she says, are felt to be lonely. Loneliness can thus be mitigated but not eliminated. For Lacan, desire as well is an essentially lonely experience. It's always beckoning towards an object that is never its match, working with words that only ever half articulate it. Desire, he says, is impossible, and the analyst's desire no less so, or to flip this around, all the more so. In his characteristic pomp, Lacan says that the analyst has to place himself beyond loneliness because only the strength of desire can move us forward into the unknown. I'll finish up now. All in all, I think a pandemic life, a little like hovering around the table with Dr. Winnicott circa stage 1. The privileged are potentially provided with an opportunity to renegotiate certainly not having much of a world while having so much. The bodiless, objectless, shapeless confusion of life online isn't much of an object to offer for us as a way out. I do have to say that I love the moment when infants make language their object, which can always be carried with them. The joy of babble, stretching their syllables, the purest sing-song of speech. It is, of course, a step beyond mere breathing and surviving, and traces of this I find on the internet or in my work with patients. It also must be why Josh is turning to these, writers, and he hears their language so vividly. But yet again here, the two ends of the circles meet, since the voice leans on breath and is as immaterial as the air. This is not the hard, glossy reality of the tongue depressor or the hundreds of thousands of erroneously accumulated ventilators, but a rather elusive object that is easily forgotten, a lived reality of breathing the same air and speaking to one another since day one. More important, however, is pandemic life lived for many solely at the level of being. I mean this not merely as being sick or being without breath or being bereft or being confused about what is possible, what is there to take or to have, being without a future. I also mean this in the sense of being forced to take stock of those who we have treated as objects, who we have reduced to bodies, and who we have told that they have no right to have and who have never been properly mourned. I think it's hard to inhabit an environment that we're seeing as facilitating being born for some while not providing it to others. While the trouble with breathing is so close to the surface, one might want to say that it's merely a consequence of the coronavirus, an accidental event existentially felt. But don't you feel impelled to go a little bit further? To see this time as a return of the repressed, signaled by the cutting off of breath, the too loud and too visceral cry for help? One need not be a psychoanalyst, I think, to make this leap. The snake eats its tail in the tale of time that I'm telling, for how can the question of death not bring us back to the scene of being born, that each of us have forgotten and must remember somewhere? We just forgot what we were supposed to do. Breathe in, breathe out, but sing to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those two wonderful papers. I don't know quite where to start, but I'm going to start with the fact that I feel that that I kind of open with a slight note of possibility. And as I was kind of listening to these two papers, I felt that full, I mean, to return to kind of Josh's words, this kind of pain of loneliness, and then the actual kind of experience of breath. And I thought of myself perhaps as kind of Rousseau on this boat, and this slight kind of travel, the distance that one travels from, as Jamieson puts it, the kind of stage 1 of solitude, the stage 3 of loneliness, how quickly one slips. But this kind of element that I felt that I was kind of skipping around really kind of came to light. First of all, Josh, as you were speaking about this kind of this radical deprivation, and it was this kind of clicking kind of noise and this is kind of this the place where Jamieson ended, that this kind of the failure to mourn, the failure to have a space to mourn, is a profoundly lonely experience. So I suppose my first question is about this relationship between loneliness and mourning. And then my second immediate kind of question is on this kind of role of technology as well, which I feel that both of the papers have come, I don't want to say like a negative kind of side of technology, but there is this kind of sense in which, I mean, to return to your opening line, Jamieson, that are we doing, and I know that you're quoting someone else here, but are we hurting more than are we helping? And I was again kind of returning to this kind of Josh's line that the virus has made me all too human, that there is a sense in which perhaps there's something kind of inhuman about technology. There's something that technology is kind of testing the limits of kind of the psychoanalytic relationship. And so I just kind of wanted to open by asking whether either of you would like to kind of respond to those two opening statements, or statements as questions.
I mean, I was very taken with the kind of mashup you did about the, the virtual waiting room is not a waiting room, because it's true. I mean, the person doesn't come, experience the space, sit down, wait, think, look at who else is there if you share a waiting room with someone. It's just this virtual space, and the feeling of people clicking in and clicking out to sessions is a strange way to begin. So I don't know, I think probably for Josh and I, you feel this loss immediately, and you feel the loss of the container that the physicality and the embodied presence provides for then this other kind of more radical renunciation, either of the object or of love or an immediate response, and so on and so forth. The strange thing, I went back to seeing a few patients. I mean, so many are gone at this point, but I did go back to seeing a few patients in October. So I have been seeing people since then. And what I found bizarre was that you could almost completely scotomize, in a way, if you weren't careful, the difference between the two. That you could almost drift into the technology and feel like this is fine, this is all right. And to experience the contrast suddenly with a few patients, and also their extreme anxiety of returning and being with you in the room. You just, you thought, how could I have even for a second left this behind in my mind, which I had done for months. So it's sort of not technology good or bad, but I think it's this really interesting question about what we're speaking about, which is different states of mind and different pressures on subjectivity that then you're trying to navigate with technology, which doesn't necessarily explain itself at the same time that it's so unbelievably self-evident. It seems that way.
Yeah, I think you raise the question, Jamieson, of what it is that makes those renunciations bearable in the psychoanalytic work. One of and I think the emphasis absolutely on beginnings and endings of the session feels spot on, that what we lose is the very physical frame that is that really conditions the work. The work is made possible by the opening of a circumscribed space to someone else who crosses a threshold and then encloses themselves in it. And that sense of a sealed off space that somebody has entered with their body and then shared the space with yours. That is what can't, if you like, be metaphorized on Zoom. There is no way of sort of finding an adequate symbolic replacement for it. There are ways that you can find parallels once you're inside the session itself. There are sort of superficial resemblances between the real and the virtual setting. But in a way, even those resemblances are compromised by the fact that you've lost the conditions that make them possible, that make the being together possible, the entrance and the exit. There is a kind of ritual that a lot of patients have, because I've sort of left it to patients to forge their own ways of remaking the frame. So some people come in on video, switch off the camera, and then return to video right at the end to say goodbye, so that there is a kind of a brief bodily acknowledgement, you know, that there is somebody on the other side of this screen, and also that there is a kind of internalized memory of that threshold moment at the beginning of the end that sustains the work online. But one of the things that happens, and I think that's to do with the scotomization that Jamieson was talking about, is that a lot of people at a certain point don't switch the camera back on at the end. They lose that, and it almost evokes a kind of specifically Winnicottian gesture of kind of infantile despair. That there's a moment of sort of, it's as though you've been called for and the moment's been missed, and so at this point they just drop out of contact. So there was something, when I realized that was happening, there was something almost unutterably sad for me about that. And I realize I've used the word unutterably, and it makes me think of the pain so utter. I would love to say more as we go on about breath and Winnicott, and in particular the 7-month-old asthmatic infant. But maybe we can turn over to another question, and we'll come back to that.
Well, I mean, I have a question, but also Josh, feel free to ask that straight away. I think as we're on that, makes sense.
Okay. So I wanted, I guess, to ask Jamieson what she thought about this notion of a kind of interruption or intrusion, asthma as an interruption or intrusion of something inorganic into an organic process. I mean, I really kind of, that had totally gone out of my mind, out of my memory, of those wonderful papers from Paddington Green. And what I love about it, I think, is this sort of confounding of the opposition between organic and inorganic. Asthma is an inorganic illness in a very specific sense, that something has intruded between the mind and the body that makes bodily processes distorted and kind of blocked. On the other hand, there is perhaps a kind of, as there is in Winnicott, and perhaps as there is in every psychoanalytic theorist, it's very hard to get rid of a kind of notional, ideal, kind of pure state of being as a kind of ground zero of theory, so that there's such a thing as natural breathing that exists prior to its inscription by social processes, by material conditions. But of course, to be born is to be born into. And it struck me listening to what you were saying about George Floyd and the California fires and the various intrusions to our breathing that are all beginning to close in on us. Some, of course, more slowly and less menacingly than others, but still, the conditions that menace our breathing are closing in on all of us. And they start closing in on us the moment we pop out onto the hospital blanket. And so those intrusions that Winnicott localizes in asthma really are there for all of us, so that one could think really of our condition as, in that sense, asthmatic. And I was also really interested to hear then about the way you were mobilizing yoga and pranayama. And I'd sort of really like to hear more about how you bring that into contact with your analytic work.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I like not the idea of and I appreciate this, not the idea of the natural breathing that's intruded upon, but the very intrusion of breath itself.
Yes.
One reason to take it back also in a kind of evolutionary way, but I think of Ferenczi here. Ferenczi, had this idea that the catastrophes of the earth were in our psychosexual development, as it were, of which breathing is one of the big culprits. It was much better, he says, in the ocean, where it was fluid and we could be men and women and we could, put our sexual products into the water and we didn't have to breathe. We didn't have to create this rhythm between taking in, breathing out, and speaking, which is a crazy rhythm to put your body into, in a way. So I agree with you that the asthmatic is not the derangement of a natural process, just like neurosis isn't the derangement of a otherwise natural human development, but that it's speaking to something very real. And then you think of the pandemic as, something that's really touching all of us on this level of bringing something into our awareness. And I was very fascinated by Freud's resistance to this at the same time that he was clearly, up until the end, trying to figure this relationship out. Because still in inhibition, symptoms, and anxiety, I think the question of being born is huge, even after he had already gotten in the fight with Otto Rank about this. So, this is a cursory paper, but I guess I asked this question about what it is that we have to renegotiate at this point. What is it that we're all trying to kind of renegotiate? And I think of virtual life as breathless. It's so fast, and it's so intrusive, and it's so disembodied. And I think it's also very confusing in terms of inside and outside, which breathing is kind of constantly negotiating. Right? Yep.
Great. I just wanted to kind of come back to your, Jamieson, your final, as we were kind of talking about it, this idea of the return of the oppressed. And it seems that we've been talking about loneliness, but it's also kind of dependence has been a kind of a definitive thing that seems to be a line that seems to has come through with loneliness. And perhaps if there has been something that has been repressed, it is that sense of dependence on others, that loneliness in a sense is, I'm thinking back to Josh's two patients, and one where loneliness is overwhelming and one is pushed back to childhood, and the other where it can be the source of Rousseau on his boat, but that's only through this kind of omnipotence, through this complete control, through this to this kind of this moment where actually I don't have to admit that I'm dependent. And obviously we have gone back to object relations, and that it seems to be about these early years and finding a place for dependence in kind of everyday life. And it seems that yes, that the moment when the pandemic hits, that we're on hospital beds, that we're reminded of this in kind of brutal ways at the same time that we're radically isolated from one another. So it's finding a way to perhaps to articulate that contradiction. So again, that was more a statement than a question, but I suppose my other kind of point here that I kind of wanted to draw on was this, it was just to kind of go back to this idea of these, which again, stemming from Josh's two patients, these two different states of stage 1 of solitude and stage 3 of loneliness. And I think that in some ways that perhaps that you both haven't given yourselves enough credit for the work that you've been doing as psychoanalysts during this time, because I'm sure, although it's not ideal conditions, that it has been kind of life-saving for many people that can't bear loneliness, that can't bear these states of isolation. So I wondered if either of you would like to kind of speak to either of those comments.
I mean, I love what is it, the sum of my irritations. I'm confronted by the sum of my irritations. Yeah, this experience of the others in the pandemic, which, you've been removed from the irritation that some people forget that they feel all the time. And then at the same time, it's heightened it enormously. And so there's the question of the dependence, but also just the relationship to others. I mean, here in the US, it's mad. I mean, in terms of who thinks that who is responsible for what in relationship to the others. I mean, you cannot this is the whole conversation. Texas just lifted all restrictions, every single one. And the NBA, because I like basketball, last night had to enforce against Texas, where they had a game that they were not going to open the stadium. I mean, it's sort of wild.
Yeah. My immediate thought about Jess's question and the sort of the element of life-saving. I mean, what is interesting is that in the pandemic, no one misses a session. And there are all kinds of reasons to feel good about that, to feel good about the position that you're occupying for them. because in a way for psychoanalysis to work, actually every patient needs to see their analysis as life-saving, as a lifeline. And so the pandemic has maybe thrown that into a kind of brutal involuntary relief. There is, I think, a space that's reserved by the session that in a way sort of differentiates itself from the rest of life in a way that in some respects might even be more powerful, more dramatic than the routinization of the session as another moment in daily life. So I think that's right. And I think that the dedication and commitment and the willingness to acknowledge dependence as a fact of life and a fact of analysis, that's all been important. There's another side to it though, which is, well, you kind of occasionally, I mean, this, you know, God whisper it. I shouldn't say this in public, but occasionally you want people to miss sessions. Right? Now, why do I say that? Because missed sessions in ordinary life are a kind of statistical regularity, or rather, they're a kind of recurring irregularity. If you're seeing, you know, if you're doing 40 sessions a week, then it's a racing certainty that one of them, probably two, maybe probably three, are not going to be able to make it because something is interposed between the session and the outside world. And of course, with the constriction of possibilities for that kind of interposition, people just come. But it points to a different kind of breathing of the process. The way the process breathes when you're in the consulting room is in many ways more irregular, more open to different kinds of inhalation and exhalation. Breathing virtually, and this speaks to what Jamieson was saying about the breathlessness of virtual life. Breathing in virtual time it's not more regular, but it's more regimented. You know, things are taken in, and you know, the outside is taken in and breathed out with a kind of clockwork regimentation, and you feel this in the virtual consulting room. Off they go, click again, wait for the waiting room, the virtual waiting room to open. And what is much harder to hold on to with the sort of insistent attendance, if you like, of sessions is the singularity of other people in their lives, that they always threaten to sort of meld into an undifferentiated soup of voices and lives. And I, you know, these two poems of Dickinson that I brought, because one of them is an almost exaggerated instance of Dickinson's kind of wildly irregular breathing, where dashes interpose once, twice in every line. And you're reminded, I think, of something I was trying to say really vividly, which is that, you know, the outside interposes into our breathing from the very beginning, and nothing evokes that better than Dickinson. That there's no such thing in Dickinson as regular breathing. And of course, regular metrics are the most kind of, you know, egregious confection. You know, they are. There's nothing more artificial. The other poem, though, the last poem I read, actually breathes much more freely, and there's only one dash in it. And you know, one thinks of the singularity of Dickinson's diction and her sort of weird portmanteau words and sort of eccentric grammaticality. And that kind of, that's much harder to hold on to in this kind of much more regimented rhythm of virtual analysis, where the eccentricities of bodies and voices, I mean, that's really what gets lopped off the experience.
It's made me think kind of immediately of your work on work, Josh, and this kind of sense of, you just published a book on trying to resist this kind of 24/7 manicness, and the pandemic has kind of reinforced that in certain ways. And it, as I was kind of listening, I thought it's almost the kind of freeness of psychoanalysis is being made routine in this way that just seemed completely alien to it in a certain way. As lots of kind of professions, but it seems that it's really important that psychoanalysis is able to escape that it kind of exists on contingency to a certain degree.
Yeah.
I don't know if Jameson, you had anything to a similar kind of experience. Or...
But I mean, I was so taken by the way that you put that. I mean, even the missed session is like the throwing down the spatula moment, which is so important. Yeah, and the real regimentation of what it feels like to work in Zoom, and the time goes by so fast. I mean, when you were speaking about, finite, like the sense of grasping at time, or it's lost in the infinity of it. Both experiences in the Zoom are very powerful, but days go by. I have someone I call at Fridays at 4:30, and every time I call him, I can't believe a week has gone by. It sort of marks the end of my clinical work week. And I think Josh's point is so important. It's not regular breathing and then the irregular pathological breathing, but actually all breathing as pathological, the symptomatic breathing that attests to this fact. And then the question of what free breathing would look like, or the discovery of your own rhythm for breathing, and having analysis being the space where you create that.
I just have a final question before I want to open it up to the audience, and please do put questions in the chat box, which is the question. It just made me think about the role, I suppose, the role of psychoanalysis more generally. Like, it seems that this kind of breathing is essential, and it made me think of things like community psychoanalysis, the possibilities of kind of psychoanalysis being more readily available. And I wondered if either of you had any thoughts about that, and specifically in the pandemic, about psychoanalysis' social role kind of more generally.
Yeah, no, it's something that we hadn't, one of many things in the pandemic that the pandemic allowed us to realize we hadn't been sufficiently attentive to, that we, in a way, mouth the restricted availability of psychoanalysis as a virtuous platitude, and then we carry on and shrug our shoulders. But I think that what we've seen through various initiatives, certainly in this country, I'm sure a lot in the US as well, various initiatives growing up where people who really have been cut off and in kind of dangerous isolation have been offered some access to psychotherapeutic contact, which of course in the first instance is going, and appropriately I think, to just be the most ordinary support work, the affirmation of the existence of somebody else at the other end of the line, and their availability to, to whoever's suffering. But I see one or two people who have had their incomes made radically precarious and heavily reduced. And, you know, in a way, the choice has confronted me, you know, kind of withdraw into the cell of my relative prosperity, drop them and find someone else who can pay, or just come to an arrangement. And without, you know, sounding pious, because this is for me as well, I've just really felt a need to come to an arrangement. I had a habit anyway of a kind of tithing, of giving. I mean, there's no pro bono work in psychoanalysis because you have to pay something, otherwise it's meaningless. But you know, yeah, trying to sort of tithe to do a percentage of very low fee work. But again, the urgency of that, the sense of the lifeline, has really been cast into relief by the pandemic.
I've been struck by the need of children. I'm like a hub for pediatricians' offices. So, and I still, after all these years, take all the calls, which adds like an enormous burden because I can't see any more kids anyways. But the amount of calls that I'm getting is bananas. But these kids are at home with their parents all day long and they can't see their friends. And it's really devastating for them in various ways at the different developmental points that they're at. And so I think about that a lot, and also how hard it is to work with kids virtually. And I've been really moved. I have a teenager who comes to see me in my house on my back porch, and we've sat with like our hats and earmuffs and like jackets on the back porch because she really just wanted to see me in person and to not, you know, her whole life is online at this point.
Thanks so much. If anyone wants to jump in here with a question, please do raise your hand, unmute yourself. I know it's slightly more intimidating online, perhaps. But as we're waiting, I mean, I think it's very interesting in terms of, in fact, that we haven't kind of talked about. I suppose that we've assumed that we're talking about adult psychoanalysis throughout this session. Actually, children, especially children who are not at school, who are at these kind of crucial stages of development, are being hit in this kind of particular ways by the pandemic, and that psychoanalysis again being this kind of lifeline that it seems so kind of vital. Yes, I mean, I suppose I'm just kind of going back to the need for having these kind of better public resources, but also kind of it stayed with me that a sense of embodiment and the teenager sitting with you, and that human presence, to go back to kind of Josh's kind of phrase that in some ways the pandemic has made one all too human, but it's also kind of brought about this need for that kind of a vital human presence, and that seems to be like a, you know, one way of countering loneliness. That presence is kind of instrumental.
It is also just worth mentioning, of course, that long before the pandemic, mental health services had already been decimated by austerity, and the sort of the austerity, the sort of ideological austerity of a certain kind of provision, you know, short-term cognitive therapies that simply don't answer to so many people's particular needs, and that, you know, again, the pandemic has just amplified and magnified quite how ragged and damaged our services were. We've got a raised hand, I think.
Navigate. Who's the raised hand? Sorry.
Diego.
Diego, do you want to speak?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So I have a question about the idea of, I guess, the difference perhaps that you sense when analysts have their cameras on or off. I know that for my own analysis, I don't have the camera on, so it's basically a phone call. And it seems to me that ever since this happened, and I don't have to physically go into the room, there is this sense that it's easier. And I know from talking to friends who are also in analysis, and people from my from CFAR in London, that it's easy. It seems like it's easier to be forthcoming, I suppose, when you're not there, right? When it's on the phone, and I'm not sure if it would be the same if the camera was on, but I'm wondering if that's the case, if this isn't a false sense of working through.
I mean, I think it's, it's very case by case. You can't make any pronouncements, but I'm very careful when listening to the difference that the patients often speak about in speaking to you on the phone versus speaking to you in person, and the inhibition that they'll often talk about in meeting with you in person and wanting to rush back to the phone. So, it's important to note, right? And I mean, the Lacanian leniencies with the frame were such that you want to be careful either about the ritualization or the resistances, even you yourself as an analyst, to making sure that you're providing the right environment, which is not a given just because you're on the phone or in the room.
Can you just quickly say again where you saw the false working through?
No, I was just wondering if my feeling, for example, and I know that it's one that other people share, of feeling like you're accomplishing more because, as Jamieson was saying, like there's less perhaps inhibition because you're talking on the phone. So perhaps similarly to any virtual interaction where fantasy might roll off of your tongue without much inhibition, but then if there's going to be sort of a passage to the act, I suppose, then I'm not sure it would roll off so easily. So that's why I'm wondering if the idea that I feel like I'm able to be more honest, I suppose, about what I'm gonna say, if it's a false sense of, it's a false working through, because once bodies do meet, maybe it turns out that actually this is a question of virtuality and not actually working through proper.
Yeah, intuitively that feels right. I think that's all I'll say about that. That just chimes with my sense of what the virtual consulting room has been like. That its lifting of inhibitions has been very much at a certain level of discourse, and what it's facilitated is a kind of, in a way, a greater articulacy, a greater flow, a kind of easier flow of speech. And I also think it's given a different quality to silence and hesitation, because that feels, partly for some of the reasons I was saying, much more technologically mediated. you know, the very fact that there is a self-conscious question when one hears a silence as to whether the signal's dropped means that, you know, there's a kind of intrusion into the contact between one unconscious and another.
I'm not sure if we have any other questions. Please feel free to kind of jump in here.
Question from Lana.
Lana, do you want to go?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for your really beautiful and compelling thoughts. I was just following up on something that Jamieson said about Winnicott. If loneliness is stage 1 and solitude is stage 3, then what is stage 2?
It's a good question. I mean, Winnicott, it's play, and it's certainly having. It's not either the being in, as Josh put, a kind of undifferentiated state, which can either be glorious or can be shrinking back. I also thought it's interesting because he talks about the baby making the mother and making the doctor the baby. So you get to play with this self-representation, as it were. So there's so much a moment of turning passive to active. But, you know, with this question of what it would mean to let go of that great pleasure of having, and he talks a lot about the confidence of the baby in that moment. Like that they even have this posture of, you know, oh, here I am. And it's a very beautiful moment. He says at any one of these we can get very stuck. Each is its own labyrinth. And I like what Josh was saying about the kind of breathing apparatus of psychoanalysis, that it's not about, you know, making it to stage 3, but it's about traversing these moments, all of them.
As we're coming to the end, I wonder if we could, I kind of had in mind the idea of the kind of nuclear reactor that Josh kind of mentioned. And I suppose to take us full circle in a way, I feel like we've kind of gone from the possibilities of loneliness, the pain of loneliness, and the kind of the breathing and the edge of breathing. But I suppose, is there a kind of, has this moment been useful for kind of reassessing where we've been? Is there a way in which we need to be out on that boat in order to kind of reassess maybe that we've been lonely all along? Is there something that not to be kind of too glib and say that, you know, that there has to be a kind of takeaway from this moment, but in terms of kind of psychoanalysis, what would be yours?
I just noticed a certain kind of establishment and then quick ossification, really, of a narrative of the pandemic, in which you have, you know, stage 1 lockdown, in which everyone discovers the ecstatic joys of solitude, which then gives way to a kind of fatigue. And then by the time we get to lockdown 3, as we know it in this country, we sink into a kind of cynical despair, not only about the present moment, but a kind of bitterly ironic light cast on that first lockdown moment. What were we thinking? Sort of imagining ourselves to be rediscovering or communing again with our own solitude. A sort of not so much a kind of, I mean, in that particular cynical version of loss, not so much a longing for touch or for human contact, but for a return to a kind of putative normality, as though the triumph of this normality would be to laugh at the idea that there was ever anything to learn, anything to be gained. So I wonder, in the long term, what will happen to the memory of that strange early optimism, where the pandemic was not being celebrated, I think, in a scotomizing way, as though we could forget about the privations and the suffering and the death, but because it raised fundamental questions about our relationship to the world and how we wanted to organize it and what its future could be. And I think in the haste to a return to a sort of mythologized pre-existing world, preceding world, rather than a transformed world, there is a kind of shame or an embarrassment, I think, that everyone is trying to insinuate into that early optimism. It becomes almost a utopian moment that that we disown, and I wonder if it can stay in the memory, because I think it is something. It is a moment that harbors a lot of utopian nuclear reactive energy. That's my thought.
It's so right. I mean, it's even. I feel like it's even worse here. It's that there's this risk that it's going to have been declared a mistake, almost from the get-go. Which is, on the one hand, all of our admonishments towards the prior administration, but just in general, the confusion that we're in about what responsibilities we had. So somehow that crowds the space of what was the experience at that very beginning moment. But I have faith, as you do, I think, in the memory. And especially for the kids, because they can't, I mean, there's no normal for them. So they just went from non-normal into this. So what they're going to remember, it's going to be astonishing.
Yeah.
On that note, I want to thank our speakers so much. It's been an absolutely fascinating discussion for me, and I greatly enjoyed these beautiful papers. And I wondered whether you would all unmute yourself so we can hear the human presence in the room, to give one round of applause to Jamieson and Josh. So I will start. It is strange to feel that.
Yeah.
But I certainly know that they were have been very well received. A reminder that our next event in the series is on the 18th of March, so in 2 weeks' time, which is on Motherhood's Lonely State. So in many ways, kind of picking up on some of the kind of themes that we've raised here. And there's lots of thanks coming through in the chat. And so I hope to see as many of you as possible there. Yes, do send me any questions if you have any questions about future events. But thank you so much, everyone.